Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending and for being part of this remarkable event.
You have to be louder.
Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Iman Sheel, and I will be your host for this session. Here with us today, all the way from London, is the talented British Somaliland author, Nadifa Mohamed. Nadifa Mohamed was named last year as one of Grant's Best of Young British Novelists. She won the Betty Trask Prize and numerous award nominations for her first novel, The Black Momba Boy, in which she transformed into fiction the true story of her father's childhood journey. Nadifa Mohamed's second novel, The Orchard of Lost Souls, beautifully chronicles the life of three women struggling to endure Somalia's devastating war. The novel begins in Hargeysa, three characters, Kausar, a middle-aged widow, Deqo, a 9-year-old being attacked at a government parade, and Kausar steps in to defend her. Filson, a female soldier, arrests her. These are the lost souls who must find themselves. Nadifa, thank you very much for being here today.
It's an honor.
If you could briefly introduce yourself to the audience about who you are and what inspired you to become an author.
I was born in Hargeysa Group Hospital. I was raised in Guryo until we moved to London to join my father, who was a sailor in the British Merchant Navy. I started writing, I always say, by accident. I actually worked with Yusuf for a while in a film company, and then I decided at first to make a film about a man named Mahmoud Matan, who was a Somali sailor like my father, who settled in Cardiff, married a Welsh girl, had 3 children, and then was wrongly executed for a crime he didn't commit. So while researching that book, I found out that my father knew him and started interviewing my father about what brought these Somali men to the UK. And the story that I discovered was remarkable. My father had lived life within his early childhood. He was a street boy, a child soldier, a refugee, a businessman, a musician, so many different things. And discovering that story made a writer out of me. So after completing that book, which was about men in many ways, I wanted to turn my eyes to the women in my life, and particularly to the situation that my grandmother, Nadifa, found herself in 1988, when she was left by accident, abandoned as the Civil War began. And she was paralyzed after a car accident and couldn't leave the city while the bombardment was happening, while the fighting was going on. So it was something that I was aware of all my life, but hadn't really thought about in detail. And when I decided to, I realized the horror that she must have experienced. She was an incredible woman who'd raised my father single-handedly. She'd worked in Aden in coffee factories. She'd lived in the borderland between Eritrea and Sudan for most of her youth. She'd married 6 times. She'd taught herself how to make perfume, how to embroider, how to tell fortunes. So she returned to Hargeysa in later age as a kind of retirement. Hargeysa was a calm, small city that she knew well, and she thought that she would live her life out peacefully. And it didn't turn out that way. In reality, she died in one of the refugee camps on the Ethiopian side of the border. And that tragedy was brought home to me when I visited her old home in Hargeysa, where she'd had a small mud-built house and then a garden behind, where she'd spent all of her time, all of her energy growing fruit and things like that. And when I returned in 2008, all it was rubble, scrap metal, decay, and even apparently there was a landmine where her home used to be. So from this place of life to this place of death. And I would say that's where my novel began. And then around that I researched, I interviewed people who I met in Hargeysa and really tried to look at the war from the female perspective. We talk about the war still in very political terms, very male terms. And if I had stayed, if we hadn't left in '86, but I'd been here in '88, I wanted to imagine what that would have been like for me.
Thank you very much. I'm going to touch on your first novel, The Black Momba Boy, which revolves around your father, Jama, who was young at that time, and this was during the Second World War, around the 1930s and 1940s. Now, few of us would actually, write about our family. So what inspired you to actually write about, your father, or what you do? Yeah.
Well, it was interesting actually to listen to Nuruddin's discussion earlier, because I didn't have that kind of hierarchical family life. My father was absent because he was a sailor, so my mother was the head of the household until we went to England. And then even in England, my father was a distant figure, but I didn't find him an oppressive figure. He wanted us to be able to argue with him, able to challenge him. But we didn't have a friendship, or I didn't know too much about him as an individual. And as he got older, he mellowed out and he wanted to tell us his stories. And I was willing to listen. So I actually did the very first interview with him before the book ever started. And it was while I was at university and I was becoming more and more curious about my roots. So I think there was something going on. I don't know if it was an identity crisis or just a growing curiosity about why I had the life I'd had. But I did that first interview in 2001, and then when I returned to the idea of making a creative piece of work, a film or a book, my father's story just started taking over my mind.
In your second novel, The Orchard of Lost Souls, the story ventures into a gender-specific world of pain and discrimination experienced by Kausar, Filson, and Deqo. You mentioned in your book a very powerful statement where you said, "The shame that grows and widens with girls, breasts and hips, and follows them like an unwanted." Could you elaborate?
I can. My father was physically brutalized. He grew up in a colonial world where being a black boy, a black man, made you subject to the violence of white men. But the relationship to the body was different to the way that women relate to their body. Even I've grown up in safety, I've grown up having lots of opportunities, but the focus on my body, on female bodies in general, is intense. What clothes you're wearing, how you behave, and I know that that's a big difference between the way that boys and girls are raised. That especially Somali girls are raised with this idea of ebb, shame. And it's not ebb to do with your behavior, your morality, your ethics. It's to do with controlling this body that might cause you trouble and might cause other people to give you trouble. So I knew that would be central to the experiences of the female characters.
One of your characters, Filson, was a soldier, and a Somali woman soldier is quite, a rarity, to be honest. And she was trying so hard to be accepted. She was a feminist, but she was trying to be accepted as an ordinary woman. Can Can you elaborate on that? And has the society's attitude changed towards women in 26 years?
Yeah, well, I think Somali society over the last 100 years has turned on its head many times, from being a nomadic culture to then being a colonial culture with new economies and new opportunities and new problems. And then the independence period, the dictatorship, which said that it was going to reform the way men behave and the way that women are. So that was something that they focused on. And someone like Philson, who was born in that time period, would be able to go to university, would be able to do all of these new jobs, but she wasn't actually respected. So it was a dichotomy where you weren't a traditional woman, but then you didn't have the same rights as a man. So you're stuck, especially in a male world like the military, where violence and authority and power are seen as male traits. So Philson is very confused. She's raised by a father who wants her to have opportunities on one hand, and on the other hand wants to completely control her. So I wanted to look at how women behave in those male environments.
26 years, I mean, this incident happened during 1987 and 1988. So 26 years on, do you still believe that we're experiencing the same issue as a Somali woman?
It's a difficult question. I think that when I come to Hargeysa, I can see the number of women going to university, the number of women holding down jobs and traveling and doing different things. But still attitudes emerge that are very disturbing. Earlier on, when Nuruddin was talking about the letter he wrote as a 9-year-old for the man who wanted his wife to return and who threatened her with a beating that would break her bones, and he would then drag her home. Many men here clapped because that's seen as a manly thing to do, as a funny thing to do, but it's also within his rights to do that, to bring this unruly woman back to control. So those attitudes haven't disappeared. And I think that someone said that we should do a survey because a lot of what we're talking about is our emotions and our prejudices. But even if we did do a survey, the number of women who would experience domestic violence, sexual harassment, I think would be really high. I'm happy for it to be a more scientific approach, but I think that would back up what our prejudice is at the moment, that women are still abused in many different ways.
Both your books, the Black Momba Boy and The Orchard of Lost Souls, share a common theme. It talks about war. What would your third book be about?
I know that it will be set in London this time. London is the city that I've grown up in, and I know better. I can say that I know it better than Hargeysa. And that's my small part of London. So it will have Somali characters at its heart. And what I'm thinking of right now is actually looking at the ramifications of civil war for people who didn't directly experience it. There are lots of young people in London that I know who have had very serious emotional and psychological problems. Not necessarily because they experienced violence, but there's been such trauma, and it's bounced between family members and come out in different people in different ways, that many people that I know have had breakdowns, they've had mental health crises, and it's to the point where I almost see it as an epidemic. And to see the roots of how the war affected people who weren't even in it is really what I'm going to look at.
Do you have any plans in turning any of your books into a movie?
I would like to. I think that Black Momba Boy is such a big story. It covers so many different countries. It'd be very expensive to make, very difficult to make. While Orchard of Lost Souls is set in a small part of Hargeysa, really, mostly. And I would like to make that into a film, using local people as the cast and crew. But we'll see when that happens.
A little birdie told me that you play the oud. Okay.
I was actually... last 2 years ago, I arrived here with the book festival, and Hudaydi and I became friends on the journey home. And since then, I've been having lessons with him on the oud, the qaman. And I was meant to perform here with him. I had learnt 2 songs, Banadir and Hayan, but he's not here. So hopefully, inshallah, next time we come, we'll perform together.
We look forward to it. Musician, writer, and a filmmaker. You're artistic. So, I mean, you've got a lot of talent. So, how do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as an author? I mean, how do you categorize yourself?
I think my main job is writing. That's how I make my living. That's where my mind constantly goes back to, is another book. I would like a break after the third one because I've been traveling a lot. I've been publicizing these books a lot, and you get exhausted. I feel quite exhausted. So I will have a break after the third one. But my grandmother was the same. She tried lots of different jobs. She was an opportunist, and I am the same, and my father's the same. That you can't limit yourself. You have to take the opportunities as they arrive. So that's the kind of family culture. But at heart, I think my main life's course will be as a writer.
As an author, how much control do you actually have in your book? I mean, or are you dictated by the publishers?
Not at all in my experience. I think people often have a prejudice that you write what your publisher tells you, and your publisher tells you to write whatever is marketable for a Western audience. So that's something I hear occasionally, but it's the opposite in my experience. I'm left to write what I want, how I want it. The publishers will edit and question what they will advise, but the decisions are all your own.
Most contemporary writings and films about the Somali region, or even Somaliland, tend to focus on the negative. You know, for instance, drought, famine, war, and etc. So, what would your advice be to any aspiring Somali writers who would like their books to be published, basically?
Write what you want, because that's the only way you will ever finish. You need a lot of discipline, you need a lot of persistence to finish a book. And if you're writing for any other reason apart from this is a story you deeply want to tell, I don't think you'll finish. But it's also, I find that argument aggravating in a way, because we're now having the centenary celebrations of the First World War, which started in 1914, and British people have been writing about the First World War from the minute it ended to now, and no one tells them you've got to write about something different. So Somalis, we're very, very close to this civil war that happened, and it's still ongoing in different parts of the country. So it would be crazy not to reflect on it. There are Somalis who are writing science fiction or any other genre or unrelated subjects, and they're free to, and I think that's fantastic. But for me, my life has been affected by the effects of war in so many different ways that it shouldn't be something that I have to avoid.
The Orchard of Lost Souls. You've got 3 characters, Debo, Kauthar, and Filson. Are you related to any of those characters? Is it just, Kauthar who happens to be,
kind of based on my grandmother.
Yes, related to your grandmother. Is there any particular character apart from Kauthar that you're actually drawn to that you feel? Yeah,
I'd say all of them. I have that connection to Kauthar because in some ways she encapsulates my mother's experiences, my grandmother's experiences of seeing Somalia become independent and all of the excitement that involved, and then seeing the country slowly turn into this prison and then this slaughterhouse. So there's back to my father. I think, at 6 years old, he was doing this. He was looking for work. He was sleeping on the streets. And I find the idea of how these children raise themselves really interesting. Do they become bad or do they become good? Do they become moral? Do they care about others, or is it do you have to be in a family and well looked after to actually have that empathy? And I don't think that's the case. I think that Dergo, in many ways, is the bravest character. She has the most guts out of the other 2, and Filson is probably similar. She's an educated woman. She's someone that, if I had stayed in Somalia or been born a little bit earlier, I could have had some of the same opportunities she had. And she's at heart an idealist. She believes in the ideals of the dictatorship, of equality, of self-sufficiency, of socialism. And they become twisted. She becomes a violent person because they say that to achieve these goals, you have to become violent, you have to use violence. And she's corrupted. She becomes this person she doesn't recognize anymore. So I can empathize with all three, but I say my favorites are Dergo and Kausa.
Thank you. Your favorite excerpts from the book. Would you be able to read that for us?
It was a long time since I'd been there, but things just clicked into my memory, and a place that I'd experienced as a child was now in front of me as an adult, and a tree that my mother had planted, which was just very small when we left, had grown into this huge tree outside our house. And I wanted to keep returning to that street. Kausa closes her eyes and imagines the street beyond her walls. The sandy lanes the color of threshed wheat, everything else splashed with blue, rusting in the yards. The drought has made her neighbors paint themselves underwater, succor against despair. The desirable modern stone bungalows built by teachers, civil servants, and engineers are now dependent on donkey carts for their water supply. She feels as though she has made this street, has claimed it single-handedly from the colony of baboons that lived in the juniper forest that stood near here. Her bungalow, once a besieged fort in hostile territory, her washing torn and orchard raided. When she had arrived with Farah in '68, it had been at the outer edges of Hargeysa. The air fresh, the land cheap, distant enough from her mother's house in Dumbuluk for her to feel free, but close enough to visit each day. They had bought a large plot of land, expecting to raise a brood of children, but it didn't happen. Instead, her neighbors gathered around her slowly, incrementally, like coral around a shipwreck, creating a new suburb. They used her well before building their own, gathered on her doorstep in the evenings, and called for her help when delivering their babies. These clanspeople, the simple square structure of corrugated tin is packed to the last inch with everything a housewife might need. Soap powder in cellophane twists, fresh bread rolls, matches, toy guns and sweets for well-behaved children, plastic hoses to beat misbehaving ones. Rage, planted behind the wooden counter, tall, gruff, with weary, drooping shoulders. He arrived in '72, at the age of 15 or 16, selling milk for his divorced mother. And he slowly built a shop from his earnings. He works robotically now, exchanging the same short pleasantries with each customer. The little radio beside him, constantly tuned to the BBC World Service. He performs his dawn prayers in the shop and is still there late at night, fussing over details like a bird over its nest. The only variance is on Fridays, when he wears a skull cap over his prematurely smooth head and closes for half an hour to pray at the mosque. A scrappy beard, long at the chin but threadbare along the jaw, has appeared on his face, making him look mystical and wise. Everything well, Rage? Kausa would say. Mashallah, praise God. Business good? As good as it needs to be. Nabadgelio, Nabadino. Words simple as birdsong pass between them. Thank you.
This is beautiful. We've come to the end of our discussion, so I'd like to invite members of the audience to ask questions, to ask Nadifa Mohamed questions. And your questions need to be very short and concise, and if you could come to the point, because we're running out of time. So, yeah.
Iman is my niece. Thank you very much. I really, really appreciated how you wrote the story, and it's really, really very painful. But as I gather the story now, it seems like it comes a story that you collected from your grandma or your mother. But have you ever tried that the women who have been through, like me, being S&M and been through delivery in a jail, been forced to divorce her husband, and been, not tortured actually, but has been lived in a difficult situation, run away from the country to help. And I was in the beginning of SNM because my husband was one of the mujahideen, called Absalam Turkey, if anybody knows. So have you ever tried to talk about the people who really testimony living with the reality of the struggle during...
Aunt who had to flee and who put her children in the countryside while she stayed in a refugee camp because she thought the refugee camp was too unhealthy for them. My cousin who spent eight months in the same dress, covered in lice in a refugee camp. I also researched academically from books. There's a great book called Somalia, The Untold Story, which talks about the war and its effect on women across the Somali regions. There's another one called From Somalia to England, which was published in the UK recently, which tells the stories of refugees who arrived in Europe. So I really did. I tried to make it as broad as possible, and that's why I wanted Philson actually to tell the story of people who perpetrated violence, because that's something we never think of in relation to women. Whether they were on the side of the SNM or on the side of the government, some women were involved in the combats, in the fighting. So that's also something that we don't really ever hear about.
I will speak Somali. waxaan rabaa inaan ka hadlo aad baan u appreciate garanayaa Nadifa iyo buugga soo bandhigtay iyo heerkay gaadhay in session intan la eg laba hablood oo dhalinyaro ah oo daayar inay ku dhiiradaan oo inoo daadihiyaan macnaha qoraalkoodii iyo buugtoodii oo iyo in bulshada inta la dhageysato waxay marxaati u tahay in isbedel ku yimi attitude-ka bulshada Soomaaliyeed in habluuna dhiiradaan bulshaduna si fiican u dhageysato oo marka laga yimaado culture-kii sidoo kale bulshada inta la eg oo dumar iyo rag baa loo sameeyay session-ka dhalinyarada shaqeynaysa waxa soo dhan marka su'aasheedu waxay tahay ma laga yaabaa in la yiraahdo attitude-kii 60 sano ka hor markii Nuruddin Sagaal jirka ahaa sidii bulshada u fakaraysay ama dumarka pressure-ka loo saarayay halkii wali waxba iskama bedelin in exaggeration uu ku jiro ama buunbuun uu ku jirto ma laga yaabaa maadaama ay aragno hablay dhalinyarada wax bartay inay awood leeyihiin karti leeyahay ku soo dhiiradeen bulshadu si laaf furan oo niyadsan u dhageysanayso ay soo dhaweynayso iyagoo aanay ahayn attitude aan u arko inaan waxaan kii waqtiga marka arintaas ma laga yaabaa in la yar buunbuunay
waa muhiim Somaliland waxay haysaa xornimo laakiin wali ma haysano aqoonsi caalami ma isku dayday bal inaad arrimahan wax ka qorto Somaliland iyo horumarkeeda iyo sida loo xaqiro Assalaamu alaykum
Mr. Pasha Abdi Gabobe I want to ask it's very short you're writing mostly about as you said you're interesting about women's rights women's problems women's what they want but in a poor country all society are suffering and as we know there are a lot of sections of especially children you have disabled you have the orphanage you have so many so could you enlarge your writing or to include these different sections of the people?
I would like to ask Nadifa a brief question regarding how she builds her characters, especially those from women. One thing I find in reading many of the acclaimed novels on Somali people is that they portray a single story of the weak, the very weak woman. They portray women as very weak. And when we talk among ourselves, and if you talk to Somali men, in every Somali family you will find a very strong figure who is a woman who are influenced on the way men have become. And that's what Nuruddin was talking about, and every educated Somali person. So in building the woman character in our novels, why shouldn't we focus the women who had influence on the positive aspect of Somali people?
Company like this and would feel like her voice wasn't worth hearing. And when I was interviewing my mother, she kept saying, the things that I've seen and done are not interesting. I've not been anywhere. I've not had a public life or an interesting life. And then instead what she told me was the complete oral history of Hargeysa, which has more value than anything I would have found in any books that I read. She was there. She was an eyewitness to everything. So I really can't pretend that attitudes like that have disappeared. They haven't disappeared, and I often witness them in small ways in this festival. When I was here in 2012, there was a panel of women, 6 women of all different backgrounds. One of them had fought in the S&M. You know, they were not boring women in any way. But as they were coming on to speak, I'd say at least 60% to 70% of the male audience walked out because they thought that these women wouldn't have anything interesting to say to them. So I don't want to say that my opinion on how women are seen in Hargeysa or Somaliland is exaggerated. I really don't think it is. When it comes to Somaliland recognition, I'm here because I support what Somaliland people have achieved. I think that it's fantastic. I wouldn't want to write a novel about Somaliland recognition because for me it's a strange thing to write a novel about. But what the Orchard of Lost Souls does is it tries to investigate how we got to this situation in the first place. Why did Somaliland have to declare independence? What did the people here experience? What did they see? And how, there's now a generation of young people who've only known Somaliland. They don't know of a united Somalia. So their lived experiences are more interesting to me than a kind of a polemic about Somaliland recognition. Then it becomes very political, it becomes bogged down in what the USA wants, what the European Union wants, and you know, I have my opinions on that, but that's not what I want to write a novel on. Someone asked me here about enlarging what I write about to include all sections of society. And it does. You know, I say they're women, but women are varied. Women can be disabled. Dergo is an orphan. Kausa is bedbound. You have poor people, poor women in there, rich women in there. And people seem to think that a woman's experience is just monotonous. It's the same for everyone, and it's just not the case. My experience to your experience is completely different. It's not men only who are a varied group of people. So I have included those people. And it's interesting to talk about how men suffered in the war, because men often talk about war in this quite, either in a glorifying way, or in a very political and, you know, in Somaliland particularly, it's all about personalities. So-and-so said this in 1986, so-and-so said that in 1972. And these are people that I don't know. And to me, my mother's experience of how she survived that, how she took food to people in prison, how she made sure that we had food, that's to me where the real history is. And Ridwan asked about how to, not just how to develop characters so they're not these two-dimensional victims. And again, that's hopefully what I'm doing, what I'm achieving. Kausa shows moments of bravery. She's someone who's actually quite accepted her role. She's wealthy enough to feel that her life should have been comfortable and safe. Those were her two expectations, and for that she was willing to sacrifice other freedoms or opportunities. And even that comfort and safety has disappeared, so that's made her brave. She's been cheated of what she was told she would at least get. In a way, Philson, the soldier, she's brave, she engages in combat, but she's hollow. She doesn't have the guts to really stand up against authority. And for me, maybe that's what real courage is standing up to authority. And Dergo, as a child, an orphan child, is at the bottom. She's at the be the person who determines her future because no one else will. She will decide where she goes and what she does and how she survives. So I too am tired of seeing Muslim women, African women, Somali women constantly presented as these passive victims. It's not the case. My mother is illiterate, but she's incredibly powerful in her own way. My grandmother also was illiterate, but lived a life of almost complete freedom. So the women that I know are not like that. They're not passive. Whatever's happened to them, whatever abuses they've suffered, they've reacted to them as active people.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for a beautiful presentation. I just wanted to go back on the topic of imagination. It feels like we're going back a lot on the past and we're going back a lot on the present. And actually defining imagination, he was talking as looking forward, as a thinking process that goes into the future. So I just wanted to know if, I understand this is part of the reconstruction phase that we have to have this conversation publicly and collectively, but can we also imagine what will Somali man look like, I don't know, 5 years or 10 years down the road? What type of qualities will we have? What type of communities or society we will have? Have there been any thoughts on that, or have there been any details on that, so that if you're a young man and you're right now today growing up in Hargeysa or Somaliland, you can have that as a helpful topic to think about it in the future, not always think about the past. Thank you.
To say how proud I am of this young writer, who I will not refer to as a woman writer. Nobody says Noor is a writer and he's a man. She is a writer. And she writes about what she feels about writing. She doesn't write because somebody thinks that she ought to write about something or other. She writes about what she feels about writing. Her stories are personal. It's things that have moved her. And I really congratulate you, Hoyu.
Thank you.
I congratulate you. Follow your heart. And continue to be a role model for intellectual Somalilanders. Thank you very much.
Mahad Senate.
My name is Mohamed Mohamed, and I really equally encourage you to do, the way you work is really very fantastic, equally as Adna encouraged you to do that. My question is, can you say a little bit about other aspects of the inequality, and also how we can be very realistically and practically able to build our family in a just way, in a good relation between man and woman and the children? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would like to say this will repeat itself. Yeah. Last year, just same session, just Nadifa, just Nadifa, Iman has replaced just Oman. Remember that. By presenting your Black Momba book, there was one of audience asking you some question and mentioned you as a good writer. As a humble said, you said, I am not a good writer, I am a good reader. After 1 year, and presenting your next novel here, do you think you have moved to the way of good writer? Or what are the characteristics of the good writer? Thank you very much.
So I was wondering who inspired you to write, or what inspired you to write, or if there are any particular books that inspired you.
What inspired me to write the third one?
Or just inspired you to write in general.
And that there's Somalis in the Australian outback. We didn't envisage that. We didn't envisage the collapse of the state. So we don't know what the future holds. But in terms of actually trying to at least imagine a future, what I hope is that to young Somali men, where the women and things like that. And I think it's partly to do with being told that that life would be easier for them than it actually is. So that needs to be something that we challenge. I hope that the young people that are doing amazing things. Recently, I worked on a documentary called Return to Somalia, which was about people going back to Mogadishu in 2012. And there we followed 2 young men from London, Adam Matan and Abdi Karim. And they are members of a group called the Anti-Tribalism Movement. They're born in Somalia but raised in the UK. And what they've done is they've actually reflected on who they are. Adam in particular remembers with real pain the way that he used to treat minority children in the town that he grew up in Somalia. And he feels shame. And what he does now is he wants to eradicate that, or at least to fight it. So they recently set up an office in Mogadishu to educate young people about the dangers of tribalism. And they're 2 boys, 2 young men that I find incredibly inspirational. And they work, they've got offices now, I think, in 6 or 7 different countries. It's not just Somali tribalism that they're focusing on, it's a more global problem. So when I see people like that, I think there's going to be a good future. But there is this imbalance between how the girls are doing and how the boys are doing. And I don't think the men can rely on traditional ideas of what it means to be a man. To feel happy, they're not happy. They're struggling. They're not happy. And I wish that we can all reflect on the power we have and the powerlessness we have. There's always that balance. And Somali men in the UK are kind of powerless in some respects, but they also have power. Another person asked about how aspects of inequality, so other aspects of inequality that I touch on in my book is wealth. That's the obvious one in the world. Poor people, rich people. And someone like Dego, who's at the beginning of the book sleeping in a barrel, seeking shelter, she's the epitome of powerlessness. Kausa, even as a woman, has more power in society. She's from a good family, she's from a big clan, she has a wealthy husband who is well known and respected. So the differences between her and Dego are vast, never mind the fact that they're both female. So I hope that that inequalities, I don't see it being challenged in Somaliland, really. I see it actually widening. That Somali culture, which was actually probably less divided than Britain when it comes to class and income, is becoming more divided. I will defer to you guys if you think that's true. So there's economic inequality, educational inequality, which follows on from the first one. Being disabled in this country must be, a very difficult and painful experience, because you're often put on a scrap heap. You're not seen as someone who can achieve anything in life. And whether that happens to you later on, whether, I know a guy in the UK who was blinded as he was clearing landmines, or whether you were born with certain disabilities, it would be kind of remiss for me not to notice how being able-bodied is a huge advantage, a huge privilege in life. So you see these things, but it's often hard to actually think about what it means. Well, how would you cope in Somalia if you were blind or in a wheelchair? How do you make family life more equal? Well, it's something that takes time. I know that in the UK, the state's role in upsetting traditional family life is important. If a family can subsist on government welfare rather than the husband's income, then that takes away a lot of his power, which isn't a bad thing in my mind. But it does actually sometimes lead to a bigger problem for the young men whose fathers are absent. They come back to Somaliland or Somalia, they marry a younger woman, they get involved in politics, and their focus is not on these children they've left behind. So you gain one thing, which is a more even power structure in the family, and then you lose something, which is an absent father. So for everything that we seem to gain, we lose something. The ones that are not falling into that trap are the ones where both parents know what's up. They know that life in the West is hard. Once you get there, it's hard to get there, and once you're there, it's even harder. So to have that united family where one person's not trying to overpower another, but they're working as a team to make sure that their children have the best start in life, that's the ideal for me. Someone asked me, what is a good writer? A good writer is someone who, this is a very difficult question. There's writers that I love, and I love them because of the way they use words. People such as Toni Morrison, poets, Alexander Pushkin. People who have this ease with words and make them sing and make them dance. That for me is what I look for in good writing. But then there's another side to it, and that's writers who I admire because they always see the way that life is for other people and not just for themselves. I'm not really interested in writing that is insular, which is about looking at your own life and how you're disappointed with small things. People such as Arundhati Roy, whose books recognize what it must be like for life in India for Harijans, for untouchables. So a social awareness for me is important. Nuruddin, who's very brave. The discussion we had this morning, he challenged. And that for me is what the essence of good writing is to challenge. What inspired me to write? I don't know if I did say last time that I was a reader rather than a writer, but I am both, and I fell in love with books as a reader first. I only came to writing as an accident. It wasn't something that I planned to do, but then it tapped into something into me. Like, as a child, I was always a daydreamer. I was always outside of my situation, thinking about another place and what it'd be like to live another life. And that's basically what writing is imagining yourself constantly somewhere in a part of my brain that is untouched by everyday life. I can go back there, and I'm there with her. So it was an accident, but something that was, it tapped into something that was probably already there that I didn't know about.
There are some in the diaspora who are here in Hargeysa at the moment, and they're all eager to do something.
And not just the diaspora.
Exactly, as well. Everyone is quite eager to make a difference. So what would your advice be? Because initially you mentioned the anti-tribalism movement, and they went back to Mogadishu. How do we inspire more people to come to Hargeysa, Borough, different Berbera, different areas? Seeing as though, you know, we are in London, we're in the diaspora, we need to make some difference.
We have to be careful about thinking that they're the solution. We're not the solution. The people that are here 100% of the time are the solution. We do have a role to play. You know, if you have an education, you have a particular skill and you can share it. For me, my focus, if I come back to Hargeysa for any length of time, would be street kids and orphans that people perpetrate can be the results of things that they experience themselves as children. And to intervene at that stage is what I think is really important. There are lots of fascinating people. I love Ahmed Ibrahim Mawale's work, his writing, as well as his social work, Edna's work, Dr. Aden's work. There are so many different people here. And if we can support them when they're here and already starting things rather than coming here with very vague ideas, that's probably the best use.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end. You know, I have to say, you know, I found this particular interview very inspiring, and I hope you find it very inspiring too. You know, as Somalis, we tend to be an oral society, and we rarely document our stories. And Nadifa have done an amazing job in documenting our history and sharing it with a wider society. Thank you very much for coming, and Nadifa's book is available. You can find it at the stall.
The last comment I will leave for Nadifa about the book.
Okay, just one thing, and I will bring more tomorrow.